Hello, I'm Robert Quinn, Executive Director of Scholars at Risk. Welcome to Free to Think 2020, Scholars at Risk's virtual conference marking the release of our annual Free to Think report. The conference includes 5 geographically organized sessions discussing academic freedom issues in China and Hong Kong, India, Yemen, Turkey, and Eastern Europe. It also includes a special session marking the close of Scholars at Risk's 20th anniversary year, including the release of our report and presentation of SAR's Courage to Think Award. I thank everyone in the audience for joining us for this session and invite you to visit the conference page for the schedule and links of the other sessions. I also invite audience members to use the comment function in Vimeo to share your questions. But please try to be brief to make it easier on the panelists. And note, you may post your comments anonymously if you have privacy or security concerns. Audience members may also use the like function in Vimeo to support a question that someone else has asked to help it move up to the top of the queue. This session is Academic Freedom Issues in China and Hong Kong. I will be your moderator. It is my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens is an associate professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as a faculty fellow with the Clements Center for National Security and a distinguished scholar with the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Her work focuses on East Asia, American national security, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy, as well as how non-democratic authoritarian politics affect global academic freedom. Her first book, on how non-democracies manage their coercive apparatus, won several awards, and she has testified before the US Congress on issues of security and democracy in the Asia Pacific. Our other panelist is Hua Ling, the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Hong Kong University. He is a professor of law and holder of the Warren Chan Professorship in Human Rights and Responsibilities. His research has included the rise of human rights lawyering in China, the politics of anti-corruption enforcement, evolving mediation processes, rule of law reform in China, and the constitutional status of Hong Kong, in particular central-local relationships in the Hong Kong context and national security legislation. He is widely published in books and local and international journals. Hua Ling and Sheena, thank you for joining us. Each panelist will share brief opening remarks, after which we'll have an opportunity for discussion and questions from the audience. Sheena, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Rob, so much for the invitation to be part of this important event. And it's really a pleasure to join you and to join Professor Fu and to talk about these issues. The work that Scholars at Risk does is very important for documenting issues of academic freedom as they change over time and across different countries around the globe. And I think it's especially important to be talking about these issues this year, given some of the novel issues that the report raises about the impact of the pandemic and coronavirus on academic freedom. And I know, I think this effect will last, much longer than the duration of the pandemic itself. I know that when I was writing my first book about human rights violations and repression during the Cold War, that I relied on the reports that were issued at the time by organizations like Scholars at Risk and other human rights groups in order to understand what had happened over the course of that period. And so I think the documentation that has been created here and the information that's provided in this global perspective is a really important contribution. And so I just want to start by acknowledging all of the work that went into generating the report and how important I think it is to have this information gathered in one place and a global perspective provided on these issues. So that's something that we know will really stand the test of time. What I want to turn specifically to is to talk a little bit about the section of the report that focuses particularly on China, and then to talk a bit about that, how that interacts with another section that receives attention in the report, which is the impact of the remote world that much of higher education finds itself operating in these days. And so as I read through the Scholars at Risk report this year and the Free to Think report, I was really reminded of some results from a survey that I did a couple of years ago with a co-author, Bori Truex, about the frequency with which foreign or international scholars working in China encounter repressive experiences and encounter repression in one form or another. And many of those themes continue in this year's report. A few have become much more acute. And so one of the things I wanted to note in particular is that we noted in 2018 that although there were scholars that had been temporarily detained and, for example, had their notes examined, that long-term arrest and detention were relatively rare. And as the report this year notes, that's something that has become more common. So there are 5 scholars that are mentioned in the report in particular, 4 of whom appeared to be ethnically Chinese, and 1 of whom was visiting from Japan. And so for international scholars in particular, scholars from international universities, which is I think 2 or 3 of the 5 that are mentioned, to be arrested and detained for longer than a couple of hours is an increase and a change, an escalation in what we've seen. Granted, these are still very small numbers, but we are seeing that that's increasingly a tactic that's being employed even against scholars, international scholars who are working in China. The report also mentions, I won't dwell on Hong Kong, but a number of scholars who have not been allowed access to Hong Kong to do their work. And again, that's a relatively new development. I'm happy to come back to that, but I know that we're going to have a preeminent voice on these issues in Hong Kong talk in depth about the city later, and I don't want to get ahead of myself on that discussion. So I think it's important to note that even though there are parts of the report that document the continuation of longstanding practices that are concerning from a standpoint of academic freedom, there are also a couple of places, notably in the arrest and long-term detention of scholars, particularly scholars arriving from abroad, that raise particular concerns because they are new and escalatory as compared to what we would have seen 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I think it's important to note that because it places a real chill on people's willingness to travel to China, to engage in research, to engage in candid discussions. And that free exchange is really at the heart of a lot of academic work, whether it's in the sciences or in my own field in the social sciences. Not being able to talk to Chinese interlocutors and have what are often quite lively arguments with people is a real loss to the academic community. Both to academic freedom, but also to the productivity and the quality of the research enterprise itself. And so I think it's important to note both the effect that this has on these particular individuals, but also the chilling or deterrent effect that I think that this could have much more broadly on academic research and just simple academic exchange that forms the heart of the scholarly enterprise. One of the other things that I wanted to mention too is the way that changing conditions in China combine with the shift to remote teaching that we have all experienced in 2020 as a result of the coronavirus and the ongoing issues with pandemic control, certainly here in the United States where I sit this evening. And so we've had a lot of conversations among folks in North America and Europe and elsewhere around the world about the implications of the national security law that was passed over the summer. And I think it's the combination, what I see is particularly Again, potentially concerning for academic freedom is the combination of the shift to remote teaching with the passage of the Hong Kong national security law over the summer. Because the passage of that, let me back up for a moment. In the spring, when we switched to remote teaching, people kind of made do, did the best they could with a largely unexpected situation, and there wasn't, the national security law was not in place, right? And so the legal framework in China, as it related to teaching or discussing what were considered sensitive topics, was quite different. And so then over the summer, between the spring and the fall semester, we had the introduction of a major legal change that signaled a shift in the boundaries of what we could discuss, and potentially what kind of classroom discussion might cross lines. And I want to note here that actually, the uncertainty of what the boundaries are is itself a major feature of the challenges to academic freedom. I think this is true in China, or as it relates to China and teaching about China, but it is also a general issue with any sort of non-democratic state that sends students abroad to, for example, participate in an American classroom, but then tries to say you can or can't say X, Y, and Z, because that's so antithetical to the way that the education system functions and the type of debate and critical thinking that it tries to engage in and encourage students to engage in. And so that heightened uncertainty about the boundaries of what acceptable discourse, acceptable topics are, combined with a situation in which all of a sudden you have a large number of students who are now taking classes remotely from home via Zoom or another platform, which may or may not be super secure. And we've seen a number of issues with Zoom and other platforms related to the security of the platform and what's been said. There's just an incident a couple days ago in Massachusetts where a presentation by a Uyghur student was Zoom bombed, I think is the correct term of the times. I'm sure there's a fancy phrase for that, but I can't come up with it. And so I think what we're seeing here is that not only have the boundaries of sort of risky or sensitive topics expanded to cover potentially a lot more issues that would be on, say, a standard, understanding China syllabus, but we've also seen that those activities are potentially more visible to the governments of other countries around the world, including some governments that pose substantial challenges for academic freedom. And in my case, I teach and work on China, I don't want to put students in a situation in which I'm asking them to engage in a conversation that could get them in trouble. But I also feel an obligation not to self-censor and not to truncate the discussion in my classroom to avoid these so-called sensitive topics. And so there's been a lot of serious work and thinking among my colleagues in higher ed, but it's been a very, very difficult problem. And a lot of universities have had to simply notify students and say, look, we will do our best to make the platform secure, but we want to make you aware that there is only so much that we can do. And if you are physically in a place where there is a legal framework that somehow might run into issues with the class, you should either talk to the instructor or consider another class. And generally those decisions are left up to students to make, but that's a tough place to be as someone who cares deeply about academic freedom, about the freedom that we have in the classroom to teach, to explore ideas that are in fact sensitive and sometimes unpopular, and to do that in a way that is inclusive and feels safe for students to be able to voice their opinion, voice their thoughts, think out loud, Again, this is part of the heart of academic freedom. And so to always be a little bit concerned that there could be somebody off camera or off the screen recording what's being said in class discussion is I think a sort of structural concern about remote education that we all have to grapple with and that we all are going to have to think about. So, as I think about the challenges facing academic freedom today, I think about it both in terms of the research enterprise and the challenges that we're seeing to researchers and scholars who are either based in China itself or who are visiting and trying to conduct research and academic exchange from the international community. But I also think about it in terms of teaching and what academic freedom means in the classroom and how we grapple with what I think is a potentially long-term shift to more reliance on hybrid or remote models of higher education, and that pose these long-term structural challenges from the standpoint of China and a whole range of other countries that are highlighted in the report. I'll probably stop my remarks there and be happy to talk a bit more about Hong Kong or other issues if that's of interest. But I've used my 10 minutes. So Rob, I'll stop there and go back to you for any questions or follow-up you may have.
Terrific, Sheena. Thank you so much, and really for doing a marvelous job at the impossible of summing up academic freedom issues in China in 10 minutes. So we really appreciate that. We seem to have lost our connection to Hua Ling. We're trying to reestablish it, so we'll just keep going as it is. I have a few questions, but I will remind our audience that they can use the comment function in Vimeo to post some comments and get them to us to feed them into the conversation. But Sheena, if I can, so let me just flag it for what I heard. I mean, I heard pressures on domestic scholars, pressures on foreign scholars when they're there, pressures on students when they're physically there, but also in the remote spaces, and even pressures on people who are in the remote spaces that aren't in China, right, that are overseas. We talked a bit about pressures on Hong Kong and the national security law, which definitely I want us to get back to. But if I can start with, you talked about what's different, and I think that's a very helpful thing because this is now my 20th year, and I clearly remember a conversation with a China scholar actually before we launched our network. So before we even started Scholars at Risk, worrying, would universities join the network? Would something happen to them if they joined the network, and so forth and so on? And I think to the great credit of higher education, no, nothing has happened, and institutions have joined the network, and that's fine, and that's wonderful. But the point is, these issues aren't new, right? You said what is new is there appears to have been an escalation. And I guess my question is, do you have any guess as to how or why that escalation? Is it a change of policy, or is it somehow a change of landscape that has allowed a more aggressive behavior to come forward that maybe would have come forward earlier, but something was holding it back?
That's a great question. I do have a thought on that, but before I answer that question, I did want to just clarify one thing, because I realized my remarks may have sounded like I was focusing sort of primarily on international scholars, and I do want to be clear, as your comments highlighted and sort of prompted me to clarify, that I focus on that in part because it is new. It does appear to have changed somewhat. That the privilege that international scholars have in terms of not worrying about physical safety much when they are in China has been eroded slightly by cases like Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, and my apologies if I've just mispronounced those names, and the cases that are highlighted in this year's report. But I want to be absolutely clear that the pressures are higher and the stakes are higher, and the questions are much more difficult for a lot of scholars operating in China today. And so I just want to be absolutely clear that I'm not making comparisons or suggesting, wringing my hands that this is so much worse for international scholars, because I do think that, the front line of this challenge is really the scholarly community in China, that has dealt with these issues for a very, very long time. The other thing I wanted to just note is that that's potentially new that I forgot to mention is that we've seen really increased sort of contestation and attention to the Chinese diaspora, whether that's in the United States or elsewhere. And so one of the things that I wanted to just mention is that, in our piece, we did this survey in 2017, 2018. And, we actually found that even at that time, people who had family in China or were ethnically Chinese were more likely to be approached by police or security services in China, more likely to be interviewed, more likely to be pressured or warned that their research was sensitive. And so to me, that has pretty direct implications for American policy on academic freedom and in thinking about the role of the Chinese diaspora, because there's been a lot of attention by the administration to risks of illicit tech transfer and espionage from China. But especially in my field, in the social sciences, I think it's really important to note that academics who have family in China or are members of the Chinese diaspora, to use that kind of shorthand term, are often at increased risk of state pressure. And so I think that's a really, it's important to note that that's true, that longstanding heightened vulnerability is true not only of scholars in country, but also I just wanted to flag that I think that's increasingly an issue for scholars of Chinese descent abroad or those who have family in China. And it's important that as we think about academic freedom, we also think about ways to support the people who are in these positions of heightened vulnerability. So on the question, I'll try to answer this briefly. On the question of where this is coming from, I very much believe that Xi Jinping has retooled China's overall approach to national security. And in China, the term national security, so when we think about national security, right, we have a national security strategy that is basically foreign policy. And then we have the Department of Homeland Security that handles homeland security, and then we have domestic law enforcement. In China, those are sort of all together under the paradigm of national security. And Xi Jinping in 2014 came up with this, what he called the comprehensive national security concept, that argued that China faced the most complicated security environment that it had since its founding. Not the most difficult necessarily, but the most complicated, and talked about how threats were increasing and internal and external security threats were interlocking and mutually activated. And I actually think that Hong Kong is sort of the front line of this idea of external and internal interlocking threats to CCP security. And again, I want to flag, when we say national security, the reference point is threats to the security and stability of CCP rule, not, again, the way that we might classically think about national security in North American context. Yeah. But I really think that Xi Jinping, at the time he launched the Central National Security Commission, people thought that it might be more like the American NSC, but China followed that with reorganization. It wrote its first ever national security strategy in 2015, and then set about completely overhauling the architecture of domestic and internal security. So it wrote a raft of new laws, almost 24 laws that have, by my count, that have some impact on social control and internal stability, whether it's the national intelligence law, changes to criminal procedure, reorganized a number of different organizations within the political legal apparatus, replaced most of the personnel that lead the internal security ministries through the either retirement or anti-corruption campaign investigations. Mm-hmm. And so this is really, I think, a fundamental change, where the idea of internal and external security being fundamentally interlinked, and something that happens abroad that we might not understand impacting China's national security is an intense or heightened threat if it could impact the stability of party control and party rule. And so I actually think that's what happened in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but I think there's this real paradigm shift.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think that helps if we remind ourselves that, scholars are actors who cross the borders all the time, connecting the foreign and the local and the domestic. Then we can easily see how they would be front and center in the receiving end of some of these things. So the good news is I believe we now have Hua Ling with us, so I'd like to bring him on stage. So Hua Ling, welcome.
Thank you.
And so Sheena's just given us a wonderful whirlwind summary of academic freedom issues across China. And while she mentioned the national security law, we have not gone into it. If you would be willing to just give us your thoughts on academic freedom issues in Hong Kong in particular, and then we'll come back to a general discussion.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. So academic freedom is, of course, a core value of universities in Hong Kong that has been tested from time to time, which has always been defended. So the new national security law, the NSL, poses new challenges, creating considerable uncertainty over the future of academic freedom in Hong Kong, and causing anxiety and fear among academic staff and students alike. But I believe Hong Kong is well positioned to manage the crisis and strike a balance between freedom and security, like many countries have done in the past. We need to consider the national security law over a long time span and in a wider political context. So let me make 3 points in that regard. First, political censorship has always existed in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a range of colonial legislation that criminalizes speech and a variety of censorship mechanisms in place to keep political speech in check. Those offenses and mechanisms were widely used before the 1970s, and they largely remain on the statute book. Second, by and large, and outside of a very tightly defined zone of exception, Hong Kong has since the 1970s been a place of peace, freedom, and prosperity. In particular, Hong Kong since the early 1990s has witnessed a 3-decade of uninterrupted rights revolution, which really peaked in the 2019 protest. So make no mistake, Hong Kong's system has always been different from that in the mainland, with a liberal and democratic institutional design that is built on the cornerstones of judicial independence, free speech, and of course, academic freedom, which thrived in Hong Kong under one country, two system, despite the political challenges. Third, that's the important point, is the national security law and its implementation to date have created genuine concerns and anxiety. The protest in 2019 sort of created a governance vacuum in Hong Kong, and also opportunities and incentives for the central government to assert more hands-on control over Hong Kong affairs. The national security law, with new criminal offenses punishing political advocacy that would amount to incitement to secession or subversion, and the new enforcement mechanism through the stationing of a national security force in Hong Kong, as well as the establishment of a national national jurisdiction in certain special circumstances, has the potential to scale down the scope of rights that Hong Kong has enjoyed over the past decades. It is not the end of anything in Hong Kong yet, but if not handled properly, prudently, this may be the beginning of the end. The national security law effects can be classified as the primary and the secondary impacts. Primary effects occur as a result of the direct application of the law, including the prosecution of the Tong case for secession and terrorist activities, the arrest of several people for advocating Hong Kong's independence, and colluding with foreign organizations. It also includes the fears, anxieties, concerns, and of course, the resulting self-censorship. According to the original design, the national security law is meant to be limited to the smallest number of people for their most serious offenses. And to date, the direct enforcement of the law has been very limited. However, this is what has been presented front stage, and there's little knowledge of its operation backstage. Moreover, the social psychological impact of the national security law is something that decision makers in Beijing and in Hong Kong have failed to address. Secondary effect occurs as a result of the primary effect. Teachers, for example, have been deregistered for their controversial teaching in relation to sensitive matters. And the journalists have been charged on some highly technical basis. The national security law has had its impact without being directly invoked in many circumstances. Laws such as seditious libel has been applied now after half a century of hibernation. Many would argue for political purposes, and prosecution is being instituted selectively against protesters and those who are critical of government. So in general, the fear is this: the law has been weaponized for a political agenda, and authoritarian legality may be appearing on Hong Kong's horizon. Like many countries, I believe Hong Kong does have a legitimate national security concern in Hong Kong that must be effectively addressed. The national security law is here to stay, and the universities have to manage with its new constraints. But there is likely to be a high degree of flexibility in the course of implementation and in the course of interpretation of the legislation, so as to strike a proper balance. It will be a challenge, but we can be honest about it and be transparent in the process, so as to be accountable and responsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hua Ling. And as I said to Sheena for summarizing the mainland issues, just the issues in Hong Kong are so complex, impossible to talk about in 10 minutes. So I really appreciate that. I have several questions, but I want to go. We have a question from the audience. Both of you talked about self-censorship, whether it's domestic mainland scholars or foreign scholars or Hong Kong scholars. The question from the audience is, how rampant is self-censorship amongst China scholars? And are there any ways to try to solve or address that issue?
I can start if you'd like.
Sure.
I think it's a great question, and a really important one, because widespread self-censorship would really deteriorate, I think, both public confidence in the academic enterprise and the potential integrity of the findings and the research that is published. So I think it's a really important question to answer. And again, I'm drawing partly on the work that that my co-author Rory and I did on self-censorship, and asking China scholars how they responded to a context in which they were frequently faced with real constraints and different types of what we called repressive experiences. And my answer would be that self-censorship exists, but I don't think it's rampant. I think that what I see when I look certainly at my colleagues and the people who work in Chinese politics is a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to navigate a very difficult research environment and to ask the really important questions, but to do it in a way that is A, feasible, and B, ethical. And so I personally think we should distinguish a bit between self-censorship, which is sort of self-motivated, right? It's self-interested, I'm worried about myself, and concerns for the safety of other people. There are very few research projects in my experience, both my own work, my colleagues, and advising graduate students. There are not that many projects that are risky to the person conducting the research that don't also stand a good chance of getting someone else in China in trouble. Mm-hmm. And we have ethical obligations, I believe, as international scholars in particular, to try to avoid doing that. There's the federal legal requirement that under the Institutional Review Board process that we protect subjects. But in the case of China, there's a much broader group of people that we have obligations to, whether that's a colleague, an interpreter, an archivist who allowed us access to certain documents. I think we do have to take seriously the ethical obligation to to conduct our own work with integrity and not compromise our conclusions and our analysis, but also to try to conduct ourselves in such a way that we don't get people in trouble who are more vulnerable than we might be, or who are just vulnerable, period. And so I guess I would distinguish a little bit, or at least want us, when we think about self-censorship, to recognize that some of the time when people make these decisions and trade-offs, they're actually doing it for what I think is an admirable reason. And it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't have to happen. But the constraint that's being imposed is not always a self-interested one about, oh, I just don't want to get in trouble, or I want to preserve my access. It's often, gosh, I would feel terrible if I got a colleague in who lives and works in China, or their family, or someone who helped me and generously welcomed me when I was there, in trouble.
But in some ways, that may then be more corrosive to academic inquiry, because you may not be willing to take a risk for someone else where you would be willing to take it if it was just you. So
yeah, exactly. That's what I was trying to say. I don't think it doesn't get us off the hook, right? The problem still exists. I just think we need to define the problem the right way to come up with a good solution.
Hua Ling, any thoughts on this?
Right. I think it's, in the Hong Kong's case, I think self-censorship is there. I mean, if you talk to students and to faculty members, very much depends on the specific research areas. People are staying away from what they perceive to be the sensitive issues. Part of it is uncertainty, right? The boundary used to be clear, but now it's very fuzzy. Before people can see clearly where the new boundaries are, people want to be cautious. The government probably has become more assertive. Students probably would complain about certain teaching. So for a teacher, for example, if you think certain writings on Cultural Revolution on 1989 is problematic, then one easy way out is I would just take it out, right? Because of the uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the support given by the university became tremendously important. Right? A clear statement of academic freedom. Right? Even in the national security law cases, there are clear boundaries. For example, you will never violate the national security law if you simply teach 1989, teach the Cultural Revolution, but then people start to worry. Right? If you don't make a clear statement, right, the concern, the fear will linger. and well entrenched. So that is an important issue. The university has to be very open and very firm on some fundamental principles of academic freedom.
If I can second that, one of the things that's become apparent in the US is really that a lot of universities, this was not on top administrators' radar. And that scholars were basically sort of freelancing these solutions on their own with very little institutional support. And so I think that institutional support is really, really important to scholars feeling like their home institution will support and have their back if something does happen or there's some sort of incident. And I think the other thing, so the question asked about, are there ways to solve this problem? I think the other thing is just to point out that there is lots of space to do interesting work that asks difficult questions and that generates criticism and sort of balanced analysis of the Chinese political system. I see lots of work that does challenge both our preconceptions of China, but isn't sort of glowing praise. It's just a very straightforward academic analysis, but it is people who are willing to ask difficult and potentially sensitive questions. And I think part of the reason we did this survey was to actually give people a baseline. And in some cases, we've had people come to us and say, wow, the risk is a lot lower than I thought. This gives me some confidence that I can pursue this project, or that there are these ways I have to be able to continue to do the research. And it's not risk-free, but we can still, I think it's important for us to be able to have a baseline so that people don't unnecessarily engage in self-censorship. That's also part of the solution.
So I'd love to pursue that. And I should say later in this conference, we'll be talking about a project on measuring self-censorship in a different region, in the Arab region. But let's come back to that because we have another question that I want to make sure we get to. And in both your responses there, you talked about statements from institutions in support of academic freedom to try to give some structure to the ambiguity that comes with certain laws like that make things fuzzy. Or as you said, Sheena, so that there is areas where a lot of work can be done. How do we make that clearer? The question comes, is the national security law apply extraterritorially to non-Chinese or to non-Hong Kong citizens or residents? And how does that impact international partnerships? And what might we look for from international partners in higher education in response?
Let me answer that first. It is one of the biggest concerns is the extraterritorial application of the national security law. The issue is we have no idea how the law can be enforced at all, given the widest possible scope of application. Right? So far, we haven't really experienced any pushbacks, if I may use the term, in terms of our international partnership. We are all waiting what would happen if there is the first case of sort of international prosecution of an offense overseas for activities done outside of Hong Kong. So we don't know yet. It's very difficult to clarify. The law is stated in such a vague way, and we can't always imagine the consequences. So self-censorship is the solution for many, given the uncertainty of the legislation.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say there are significant extraterritorial concerns, and I would recommend that universities, one of the things I've argued is that universities need a China strategy, and scholars who engage in research need to be able to universities need to take advantage of the in-house expertise they have to look at whether partnerships make sense and whether they adequately embed academic freedom at the heart of the partnership arrangement. And if that doesn't happen, then universities really need to take a hard look at those partnerships and figure out how to embed academic freedom at the core of those enterprises.
Terrific. And that gets me to, and unfortunately, I have to say we're very close to the end of our time. So, but if I can put one question to you just for sort of brief thoughts, if you have any, and it goes back to something Sheena said a little while ago about how scholars in China, and I will add scholars in Hong Kong, really are on the front lines here. It's not the foreign partner scholars who are visiting or coming over from time to time. And at Scholars at Risk, we sort of have a belief that our work is not a conversion project. We're not trying to convince anyone of academic freedom. We believe there are people in higher education all over the world that support these values and are trying to implement these values. If you agree with that premise, any thoughts on what we as outside partners can do who want to support higher education in China to strengthen the position, or at least not worsen the position of our partner colleagues and counterparts who we're trying to engage with?
Right. So I think the issue is we're all testing here the new boundaries. We're not quite sure. So Hong Kong's universities would need all the support it could have. So if we are doing okay, then which means we are fine. So I think that is the benchmark, right? If we are not at risk, then you are not. We are at the, as you said, we are at the far front. So support us. Don't censor yourself first, right? Don't just put yourself into such a fear that you don't do anything. I think if you want to know where is the frontier, just take a look at the Hong Kong's universities first, and then give us all the support that you could give. Thank you.
Terrific. Sheena, any thoughts?
Yeah, two things. I mean, I think first of all, making sure that the universities where we have the most influence, our home campuses, that they are aware of these issues, that they are actively engaged in thinking about how to handle them, that they have built in mechanisms to protect academic freedom is more important today than it probably has been at any point that I can remember. And that matters because being able to have those partnerships does matter to institutions and universities in China. And so some pressure, it may not even be pressure, may not even be the right word, but insisting on those standards as part of academic exchange with the outside world and as part of being a globally preeminent, university, I think is a really important way for us to reinforce those in universities in China who would like to see those standards, put into practice more consistently. And I also think just drawing attention to the Chinese scholars who are on the front lines, who have in some cases paid a price for voicing their opinions, is really important. It's important that policymakers be aware, that the public is aware of that, and that the people who are in that situation know that they are not not alone. That there are people who are thinking of them and trying to support them, things that we can do to maybe bring academics who are at risk to environments where that risk is less, where they have guaranteed academic freedom. All of these are really important measures, I think, and they all should be looked at and pursued actively right now.
Terrific. Well, Sheena, Hua Ling, I have to thank you so much and apologize because obviously a 50-minute panel is way too short to do these issues justice, but thank you for giving us a quick view into the issues of the day. My apologies to everyone who have submitted questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry, there was just not enough time to get there. I would say on Hua Ling's point of don't self-censor ourselves, we of course have a chapter in our Free to Think report on China. I urge people to read it. We put out a report in 2018 exclusively on China on all these issues, a full country report. I hope you'll read that. And on Sheena's point of what universities can do, please check out our materials on promoting higher education values on our website, which talk precisely about how universities can build academic freedom issues and concerns into their partnerships as well as at home. So thank you everyone for sharing your expertise. Thank you everyone in the audience, especially those who gave us questions. Now please stay tuned for a brief call to action related to our panel discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kieran Binney. I'm a senior at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. I've also had the honor of serving for the past years as Scholars at Risk Student Advocacy Coordinator. In this role, I partner with students across SARS network to provide support for their research and advocacy on behalf of imprisoned scholars in China. One of these scholars is Professor Ilan Tohti. Professor Tohti is a public intellectual and economics professor who promoted dialogue and reconciliation between Uyghurs and Han Chinese. In 2014, he was convicted of separatism, a charge that apparently stems from his teachings at the university and writings published on his former website. He's now serving a life sentence, and his family has not seen or heard news of him since 2017. Please help Professor Tohti's family and Scholars at Risk to seek Professor Tohti's release, and in the interim, to seek the lifting of limitations on family visits. You can help by joining our student advocacy seminar program. Through this program, faculty-led teams of students conduct research and advocacy in conjunction with Scholars at Risk from prison scholars like Professor Tohti. Faculty, administrators, and students can learn more by contacting Scholars at Risk at scholarsAtRisk@nyu.edu. The higher education sector has a responsibility to stand up for its own, and it has an impact on cases like that of Professor Tohti. You can take action right now by signing SAR's letter on his behalf at scholarsatrisk.org/action. Share your concerns on Twitter with the hashtag #FreeTohti, and start a student advocacy seminar on your campus today. Together we can make a difference in the lives of imprisoned scholars. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran, for that important plea. Thank you again to everyone in the audience. As we noted earlier, this session is part of Scholars at Risk's virtual conference, Free to Think 2020. I invite you again to visit the conference page for the schedule and links to the other sessions. A recording of this session will be available soon and posted to the Scholars at Risk website, and we welcome your help in sharing the link when it's available to those who you think might be interested.